Today, we're going to be covering ACES, the Academy Color Encoding System inside of Octane Render. As an artist, ACES will allow you to access more dynamic range and a wider color space, giving our canvas more values to tell our stories and giving you more control over your lighting and color. But before we get started, I want to show you a simple example of how powerful ACES can be. Okay guys, I wanted to start this tutorial off with a very simple and basic scene, and this is because I don't want to bring too much attention to any other aspects from this image besides the dynamic range. So essentially, our dynamic range is the difference between our highlights, which you can see illustrated here, and our shadows, which you can see illustrated here. The more dynamic range we have, the more information we can fit into our image. And generally, the more cinematic our footage will look. So right now, I am in sRGB color space. I've already set up ACES, and if I switch over to ACES, you can see we've recovered all of our highlights and shadows from this image, and it's much more detailed, it's much more smooth, and it's much more natural looking. This is how your eyes would perceive an image, versus something like this is how a computer or program would perceive an image. So essentially what it's doing is it's giving us a nicer fall off. It's allowing us to increase our lighting intensity so we can start bringing up our lighting even more. And it's also allowing us to light more realistically, because in real life, lights are very bright, and the sRGB color space is not the color space that our eyes naturally see. We see a much more wider range of values and color. ACES is allowing us to replicate that inside of CG. So now that you see this example, you might be wondering, how do I get ACES inside of Octane? And it's actually pretty simple. So the first thing you're going to need to do is download your OpenColor.io config files, and this is what's going to get ACES up and running. Make sure when you download this file, you're going to store it somewhere where you'll remember it, because we're going to have to refer to it later inside of Cinema 4D. The link for this file is down below in the description. Once y'all have y'all's config file downloaded, go ahead and go over to your settings right here, and then under your Octane settings panel, go to settings again, and then go to color management. So you're going to click use other config file, and then you're going to be pointing Cinema 4D to the ACES file you have. Once you have that config file located, go ahead and make sure an ACES 2065-1 on Octane and the OCIO. Then what you're going to want to do is go over to your camera imager page and go to OCIO. Right now the view is on none sRGB. We do actually want to change this to ACES sRGB because we have an sRGB display. And then once we click that, you should see your viewport change. If your viewport doesn't change, you need to make sure you're specifically under your OCIO sRGB settings. If you're still in LDR or sRGB, you're not going to see that. So make sure you're on the OCIO profile. Once that's done, you should see the ACES color space. However, we're not finished. We still need to tell Octane to render an ACES. So we'll go over to our Cinema 4D render settings. We'll make sure we're in Octane Render, and then go down to Octane Render. Under our main panel, you can see we have a buffer type and color space. If you want to render an ACES, then you should select ACES CG. Now remember, our ACES render is not going to look like our live viewer OCIO. That's because this is an ACES and it's displaying on an sRGB display with no output transform. You'll define that output transform inside your compositing program. If, however, you want to have your render look exactly like your live viewer, then we're going to need to change a few more settings. We'll need to move from ACES CG to OCIO. From there, we need to click Select OCIO Color Space. This is going to be our output color space. This is what we're telling Cinema 4D and Octane to output in. So for this example, we're in ACES, but we want to output an sRGB. So we'll go to our output, and then we'll go to Output sRGB. Now if we select Render, our final render will look like our viewport. Now remember, this image on the left is technically no longer an ACES. It is in the sRGB color space. It's using an ACES transform utility, but it is not an ACES.